Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our debate today in this great Financial Inclusion Week. Thank you to the Center for Financial Inclusion for inviting us to host this session. My name is Antonia Esser. I'll be the moderator for this session today. We have an exciting debate after a short presentation. And today, what we are going to be covering or debating with my fellow participants here is whether CBDCs, Central Bank Digital Currencies, can be a saving grace for vulnerable populations in lower income countries amidst the pandemic or climate-related shocks. So this is obviously a very hot topic at the moment, both CBDCs and as well as climate related shocks. And it's quite a thought-provoking topic with many aspects that we are hoping to see many facets about and both sides of the coin, because really what we need in with regards to climate related shocks and also pandemic shocks is, of course, rapid response, rapid financial relief. We all witnessed it over the past years, but also as climate shocks are becoming more prevalent, this rapid financial relief is a very important lifeline for the most vulnerable in our society. And while climate change is a global crisis, the developing world, the emerging economies are increasingly being hardest hit by its effects. So not only in terms of the frequency, but more importantly, economically, and also the severity to the impact on livelihoods and the well-being can't be overemphasized. So it's quite important that we have this discussion on how global and domestic stakeholders should respond really when these disasters struck, to help these affected populations to better recover, adapt to these shocks, and also because we know in crisis situations how governments actually have to tackle so many challenges at once when these crises times hit. So to prompt this discussion today, I would like to take the opportunity to introduce you to the debaters for today, opposite sides of the world. First of all, we have Michaella Allen. Michaella is a senior associate at Cenfri, a not-for-profit independent economic impact agency based in Cape Town, South Africa. Michaella at Cenfri leads projects around payments and resilience research and technical assistance. And one of her main focus areas are central bank digital currencies. And she has been doing work in that space, and particularly on CBDCs for the past 4 years. Her work ranges from conducting CBDC diagnostics in emerging markets in Africa, for example, in Eswatini, to establishing the link between central bank digital currencies and financial inclusion for development partners such as the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. And her focus is on establishing really the feasibility of CBDC, especially for marginalized consumers, and what the real impact of CBDC is on particularly vulnerable population segments. This, so Michaella will actually be leading basically joining Michaella for the affirmative view. So we have Dr. Bejoy Das Gupta. Bejoy is based in Washington, D.C., and he's the chief economist for eCurrency. eCurrency is a Silicon Valley firm providing the technology and expertise for designing and operationalizing a central bank digital currency. So he's coming with the practical experience. He leads the engagements with central banks, regulators, and multilateral institutions, articulating the need for CBDCs and designing, implementing, and leading the policy considerations vis-a-vis these stakeholders. He's a member of the CBDC Technology Forum of the Bank of England and the vice chair of the Working Group on Policy and Governments of the International Telecommunication Union's Digital Currency Global Initiative, where he leads the financial inclusion work stream. So welcome to you both. We're going to have a pro and a con stance on this important topic. But before we do so, I'm actually going to invite Michaella to set the scene. She will take us through a brief presentation to contextualize the debate, after which I will then allow each debater to provide us with their opening arguments or positioning statements before we kick off the debate. And we really would like to invite the audience to post any chats, any questions in the chat that we will hope to include in the debate. So let's all have a great session and hear both sides of the argument, but over to you, Michaella.
Thanks, Antonia. So to not take too much time, as Antonia mentioned, I think what will be useful for everyone joining the debate today is to have a bit of context to frame the conversation of what is our focus, what is our scope, and what do we mean by CBDC. So to just give a brief overview of exactly what I'm going to be touching on, I'm going to discuss briefly the relevance of natural disasters for developing economies. I'm then going to go through some of the challenges that governments face to really provide that social safety net and to provide that rapid relief for these vulnerable populations in times of dire need. I'll then go into actually explaining the definition that we're using for central bank digital currencies within this debate before leading on to the actual debate itself and highlighting what that central debate question is that Bejoy and I will be discussing today. So I think it's not really a surprise for many people in the audience to know that the frequency of natural disasters or climate-related disasters has really grown over the past few decades, and it's steadily grown. But I think what's been interesting to note is that whilst we've seen this steady growth, or rather we've seen this growth over the past 2 decades, not only has there been a real sort of spike in the frequency of natural disasters or climate-related disasters since the 1990s, but the nature of these natural disasters are changing. They're becoming increasingly erratic, and they're increasingly becoming very difficult to predict. And I think for countries across the world, it's been really difficult to navigate that and how to prepare an economy for these types of shocks, but particularly for developing economies, because developing economies or the least developed economies are often the ones that are not only feeling the highest frequency of these natural disasters, just in terms of the numbers per year, but I think also in terms of the disproportionate impact that these types of disasters can have on your economy. And I think you can see this in the bottom graph on the slide, where although in absolute terms, these natural disasters are having a very large and disproportionately large impact on your more sort of advanced and developed economies. But if we think about it in terms of relative to national GDPs, we can actually see that the impact of these disasters are significantly higher in your sort of low to middle income countries. And that really suggests that these developing economies are experiencing the brunt of these natural disasters. And it's leaving these sort of economies, which are already in poor positions to handle financial shocks. They're put in these positions of having these shocks really exacerbate the existing constraints that they're facing. And because these are the kind of economies that are facing the kind of really harmful and impactful natural disasters and events, these events really reverberate throughout the economy, and they can exacerbate the existing fragilities of your existing vulnerable populations. I mean, one of the key and most direct ways in which natural disasters impact economies is through the loss of jobs and through the loss of incomes. And this is particularly salient in sort of your lower income and your middle income countries that are incredibly reliant on nature-based industries or agriculture But because these types of events like hurricanes or floods or even droughts can really rip through an economy and really disrupt any sort of productive activity within the space, the World Bank recently did an analysis that attributed at least $108 million worth of damage to crops and livestock production because of natural disasters that are taking place in these developing economies over the past decade. And I think for at least 80% of the population across these developing countries that do depend on agriculture for their livelihood, it means that the majority of populations in these countries are really suffering and are in need of quick injections of funds to help boost their incomes that are lost as a result of natural disasters. But I think it's also important to realize that it's not only the farmers that are affected when natural disasters take place. It's also industries. It's also micro enterprises and your entrepreneurs who really struggle when events like a thunderstorm or a hurricane can really disrupt any sort of industry and any sort of market. And in other words, take away or destroy the assets that a business has in order to operate. I think a clear example of this was in 2005, following the Mumbai floods, where it was reported that India had lost at least, or micro enterprises in India had lost up to $10 million worth of assets because of the floods, just flooding stores, ruining infrastructure and ruining assets that micro enterprises had built over time for their business. And even outside of natural disasters, I think we've all seen the impacts of COVID-19 on businesses and what it can do and what it can force entrepreneurs to forego in order to keep a business running. We did a study in 2021, so last year, looking at Ghanaian businesses and the kind of strategies that they need to employ to keep their businesses afloat as a result of the financial shocks of COVID-19. And over 50% of those medium-sized businesses had to either draw down on their savings in order to keep afloat, or they had to sell business-related assets just to keep the lights on. And that's never a really sustainable coping mechanism because it means that that money can't be invested in growth. It's simply about keeping the lights on and your employees paid. And then lastly, I think through the impacts of natural disasters, when your income is taken away from you and when you're no longer able to dip into your savings in order to survive, for many people in the low income and middle income countries, the first natural consequence of that is your nutrition and your health and well-being. And I think that's particularly clear in developing economies where more than 2/3 of households' budgets are spent on food. And that's not because people in developing countries really love food. It's because the incomes that they have are so low that the amount that they spend on food is often disproportionately much higher. But if you're now sort of taking away a household's income and taking away their savings, it's that nutrition that's going to be hit the hardest. And we've seen this in many countries over the past years, particularly in Madagascar, I think, where there's been a drought that's been going on for decades now, and it's left millions of people food insecure. And in an economy that isn't very resilient and is very subject to these natural disasters and climate-related disasters, it means an ongoing need for resilience, an ongoing need for support, whether it's from the private sector or the public sector. But that being said, even though there's definitely a clear need for governments to step in and provide this sort of rapid financial relief to help people withstand these kind of financial shocks, unfortunately, what we've all seen over the past few decades, but particularly since COVID-19, is that governments really struggle to get money to the right people at the right time in the right way. And this can be for a host of reasons and in a host of different circumstances. And we've seen this throughout history and across the world. If we look back into 1998, following the great floods in Bangladesh, there were reports that people were only able to receive funds from the government that accounted for 4% of household income. So significantly less than the actual financial needs that these households had. And then moving all the way to 2020, where you see countries like Nigeria, where only about 15% of households got access to eligible cash transfers, despite the fact that more than half of the population was struggling with food security. And then if you look on the other side of the world, in Nepal, there was the case that about 2/3 of eligible children for cash transfers didn't actually get the funds because they weren't able to be effectively targeted by the national program. So there's clearly a struggle amongst economies to figure out how to get money to the necessary beneficiaries. But there are challenges, and these challenges, I think, are very well known, and they are very multifaceted and differ between different economies. But overall, I think some of the common challenges that we're seeing in the world today is that, first of all, governments struggle to see populations that need help. And that's often because these populations prefer to be invisible. They want to sit in the informal economy. They don't want to have a visible identity that a government can trace and then discriminate against you for financial services or can target you with tax, for instance. So governments really struggle to actually just see these populations. And I think another reason as to why governments struggle is because in these countries where vulnerable populations are in need of financial relief, these populations are often not banked. So it's really difficult to actually get the money into these beneficiaries' hands. These beneficiaries are often not the most digitally connected and really struggle because they live in more remote areas or because they simply can't afford to have very data intensive packages, or they simply have basic or feature phones. And then lastly, around governments themselves not being equipped to disperse funds in a digital way. We've seen this in South Africa, where the government has really struggled to shift from a more sort of manual in-person cash out process and move to a more digitalized process because the government themselves aren't really equipped to manage disbursement in that way. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of what governments desire to get out into the world through digital means versus what their own systems are really capable of catering for. But I think because there are these challenges, it's a clear signal that something isn't working and that some shift in the system is needed. And what we're seeing is that governments across the world are increasingly now seeing, or at least open to, different types of tools and different types of systems to try and better meet this need for rapid recovery in an increasingly digital world. And one of these tools is Central Bank Digital Currencies. And to provide a bit of framing or common understanding of what we mean by a CBDC, basically in its retail form, a central bank digital currency is simply a digital form of cash. And this means that CBDC actually should ideally share a lot of the features that the cash in your wallet has. So it should be a sovereign legal tender, meaning that it's backed and regulated by the central bank. It should be a stable store of value. So the value that you have in your wallet today should be the value that you have in your wallet in a week's time. It should be a unit of account, something that can be a common measure of value for a car, for instance. And it should be fungible. So it should be something that can be regularly exchanged with different types of CBDC, but should still retain that value. It also should enable instant medium of exchange. So the minute I give a CBDC to you for a can of Coke, that value should be transferred and I should be able to walk away with that can of Coke. The only clear differences between a CBDC and cash, therefore, is one, the fact that it's digital in nature and electronic. And then second of all, in that it's programmable. So unlike cash, you can program CBDC to act in certain ways or to meet very specific needs, to target populations or to target money supply in a given area, for example. But for all intents and purposes, CBDC really just is a digital form of cash and should act in the same way and meet the same needs that cash should ideally do. So with that in mind, I think to provide even more reason as to why we're considering retail CBDC is because, yes, countries across the globe are interested in CBDC, but it's the developing world and developing economies that are really blazing the trail in terms of CBDC exploration and experimentation. And we see this from research all the way to actually piloting and launching a CBDC. And I think what's been interesting is that the reasons for sort of leading the charge in CBDCs, because these central banks are really interested in financial inclusion and the value that CBDC can offer in that regard. And they're really interested in particular use cases. These include merchant payments, peer-to-peer payments, but in particular, it's around the thinking of government-to-person payments. And because we're now seeing a lot of countries trial testing their CBDCs, and there could be some debate on the table at the bottom around what constitutes trial versus not, or what constitutes a real CBDC versus not. But the key takeaway here is that countries are very much interested in CBDC. They're very much interested in CBDC for government transfers. But because there is this very real interest, it also does present a very real risk that CBDC could pose to the financial system, and very real costs that it could pose to various stakeholders in the financial system. And I think that leads us to the key question of today's session is there a feasible or practical role that central bank digital currencies can play to support the resilience and rapid recovery of households facing these ongoing pandemics and climate-related shocks, given the benefits, but also some of the risks and the costs that they can impose? So I'm going to pause here and hand back over to Antonia.
Thank you very much, Michaella. That's great setting the scene. And I will invite now Bejoy actually to start with his affirmative position statement. So he will argue pro the statement today, whereas Michaella will take the opposing position statement. So Bejoy, over to you for around 5 to 7 minutes for your opening statement before Michaella will come in.
Thank you, Antonia. Pleasure to be here, and thank you for organizing it. Michaella, you've made my job really easy, because in your framing, and you did it so wonderfully, you've raised all the reasons for why CBDCs are even more important, not just in the advanced economies or in the emerging markets, but really in the at least in low-income economies and frontier economies, who are being impacted so hard by disasters, floods, generally hurricanes, and climate change related issues. So you've made my job really easy. Thank you for doing that. But let me just go through some of the issues. So now, the principal benefits from CBDCs, as you've pointed out, is a welfare enhancing economic gains from inclusion, from competition, from efficiency and innovation, financial stability, accessibility, very important, and meeting the broad development and macroeconomic objectives of countries, right? Now, stepping back, we are sort of 2022, we've seen COVID for the last 3 years. So there's a need for rapid financial relief, not just because of climate change mitigation, but also because of disasters, health disasters like COVID. So and that's why central banks, countries are seeking to design and launch CBDCs. So what are CBDCs? You set it out nicely. There are technologically advanced digital representation of fiat money, notes and coins. But more importantly, they're offering a safe, efficient, neutral, final, and instantaneous means of settlement. So governments can use them to get access, to get cash and financial relief to people quickly and with as little leakage as possible. Even more importantly, they're also free of the credit and settlement risk, which typically e-money has, because since central bank liabilities are being used instead of private ones. So we did some work at the ITU and the Policy and Governance Working Group on financial inclusion, and basically they identified 8 policy principles on the design of CBDCs to boost financial inclusion, and let me take you through them quickly. First, CBDCs must be interoperable, as otherwise financial inclusion cannot be achieved if consumers, businesses, and governments cannot engage in transactions across different payment systems. By the way, CBDCs are not a payment system. They're a payment instrument which central banks issue and distribute. So it must be interoperable across all payment systems. Second, CBDCs need to operate through competitive and open networks. We've just seen the problem with the networks in Korea over the last weekend when the entire Korean payments network went down over several days because of a fire. And that shows the problems if you have monopolized networks and not resilient. So competitive and open networks to deliver on cost reduction and unrestricted usage. Third, CBDCs must be secure, as otherwise cyber attacks and breaches undermine trust. And here, when I think of security, I think of the security of the core CBDC instrument, which is the responsibility of the central bank, as well as the security of the payment systems through which transactions happen, which is really the responsibility of the private sector. So think of CBDCs as a public-private partnership. Next, CBDCs must ensure transparency, safety, soundness, stability, and while meeting privacy laws, national privacy laws, very important. Otherwise, the user adoption will not be driven. And next, we talk about universal accessibility, including offline capability, and as part of the operational requirements. Now, let's move on to what CBDCs need to be accompanied by. There are three sets of policy changes which are also needed. Firstly, policy efforts should aim to close the digital divide in infrastructure, in technology, and general skills across the population. Second, to mitigate the risk of exclusion, both governments and financial intermediaries should aim to advance financial literacy programs. Very, very important. And special consideration in low-income economies, and generally actually, even in countries like the US, to vulnerable, marginalized, and underserved groups, women, youth, poor, less educated, rural areas, remote areas, informal workers, migrant workers, MSMEs. And this is very, very critical. It's part of the enabling policy set. And basically what we're trying to do is arrive at a seamless exchange between digital and physical currencies. Now, two more policy efforts are also needed. One is national identity systems would be very helpful in facilitating adoption, which could be through biometric means or other innovations. We've seen it work wonderfully well in India with the Aadhaar program, over 1 billion people. And again, that would be helpful to the success of the CBDCs. And last but not least, I would like to talk about centralized data registries, because a lot of the financial inclusion benefits also stem for giving access to credit products to those unbanked or left out of the formal financial services. And for that, if you do database analytics and behavioral analysis, it's really helpful to have that. So let me stop for now. So CBDCs are important, but they also need to be accompanied by certain sets of, as what I would call, enabling policies to get to where we want to be. Over to you, Michaella.
Thank you, Bejoy. I invite Michaella to come in with your opening statement.
Thanks, Antonia, and thanks, Bejoy, for outlining, I think, the potential of a CBDC. And I think what I often struggle with in my sort of work in CBDC is that you'll often get sort of players like yourself in the sort of central bank digital currency provider space, as well as central banks, that often claim that CBDC cannot and can never be a silver bullet to every problem that a central bank has or an economy has, and that CBDC could always be tailored to adapt to the specific context of a certain reality. But I think that's a bit misleading, and I often struggle because there's that dissonance or disconnect between what is possible with a CBDC versus the actual realities of what a CBDC is sitting in. And I think the problem that I have in saying that CBDC can't be a silver bullet, at the same time CBDC can be adapted to address a particular context and meet a specific goal, is that it often underestimates or underweights the serious problem of feasibility. Yes, a CBDC could be tailored to a particular context and could meet whatever goal that you have for it, but then it doesn't really give enough attention to what sort of environment it's sitting in. And I think for economies that are very low or middle income, and they are incredibly cash-based, and they are naturally infrastructure poor, and you have these natural disasters that are regularly impacting them and adding to millions of dollars worth of more damage to infrastructure, it makes it very hard to justify why a CBDC. And CBDC at the end of the day is purely a financial tool, a financial instrument, as you put it, and it is digital in nature. It relies on a very robust and well-implemented digital financial service ecosystem in order for it to thrive. And it relies, as you mentioned, on a host of prerequisites in order to get right, even in the most advanced economies. Now, if you're taking it back to these really poor economies, or rather sort of infrastructure poor economies, and you're coupling that with the fact that CBDC is a very institutional capacity intensive instrument. It's very demanding from an investment perspective, an investment which you may not see returns in the near to medium term. How do you then rationalize a CBDC? Yes, it could be adapted to those different circumstances, but will it be worth it? Will it be worth the cost and investment poured into it? Whereas you could maybe instead spend that money elsewhere, and thinking about what are the actual needs that the economy has and where should money actually be facilitated to make sure that when people need relief, there's a resilient system that is well-funded and can account for those needs. Now, I'm not saying that I'm against digital financial innovation just because I've got some skepticism around CBDC, but I think if a digital financial innovation is going to plug a need in an economy, it needs to naturally evolve within the economy, needs to naturally meet a problem within the economy. And it shouldn't be a technical solution searching for a problem, which I think sometimes how CBDC is spoken about, it can often turn into that. It can often turn into something that's idolized or hyped up and seems to be something cool that a country can apply to its own context. So I think my position is that, sure, CBDC could have all these great benefits and they should account for the principles that you've highlighted, Bejoy, but is it actually worthwhile in economies that are just struggling to keep the lights on in the country? So that's it for me.
Thank you, Michaella. Bejoy, happy for you to come in.
Thank you, Antonia. Thank you, Michaella, for those sort of bringing us down to earth, really. But let me approach it with a little differently. I'll give you 3 examples of 3 different economies. One is Indonesia, where half the population is unbanked, and the penetration of mobile phones exceeds it's more than 100% of the population, okay? And yet, half the population is unbanked and does not have access to financial services, formal financial services. A second example is Jamaica, where somewhere in the middle, less unbanked, but the access to mobile telecom is somewhat less than Indonesia. And I'll give you another example of a third country, which is you talked about earlier, was Madagascar, where the unbanked is even larger than Indonesia or certainly more than Jamaica, and the penetration of the telecom sector is quite low. So if Indonesia is 100 and Jamaica is 80, Madagascar is probably at about 30, right? So three very different countries. And my point is, whether you're in Indonesia or Jamaica or Madagascar, CBDC is a critical element in each of these countries. Now, why is it a critical element? We are in a digital economy. What we've seen over the last 3 years, the digital transactions in the economy is increasing more and more. Cash usage is declining. So we are demanding digital instruments. So the policy focus for central banks and governments across the world is to deliver on that. Secondly, you've talked about the need for rapid financial support. In the sort of post-COVID world, it's even more important. And really, the only way to do it is really through digital instruments and preferably CBDCs as a public good using public money. Okay. Now, third, you talked about feasibility. It's a little bit sort of getting it the wrong way around. So now CBDCs are not a silver bullet, but it provides that minimum level of digital support to build on. And as I talked about earlier, it needs to have accompanying policies like access to digital infrastructure. Then you need to drive adoption, you need financial literacy programs, and also you need governments to come in and incentivize use with moving some of the social program spendings through CBDCs. Now you talked about investment. Now investment in a CBDC world is actually not very much at all. The investment is really coming a little bit from the central bank, and by moving from let's say cash to CBDCs, they actually save a lot of money because cash is expensive, it's inefficient, it's costly. You've got to produce this stuff every year. You've got to destroy the notes, wear and tear, and all of that. So you actually save a lot of money. So what you do is move some of that investment to the CBDC infrastructure, which they have to do anyway. But remember, this is a public-private partnership. They are not building the financial payments infrastructure. All they're doing is providing the payments instrument. And that payments instrument operates across existing financial rails. Okay, and that's where the private sector investment, so it's sort of piggybacking off the private sector investment. The other thing to think about is, CBDCs, when they come, they in turn drive improved, digital infrastructure from the private sector's point of view, telecom and all of that other stuff. So in a way, it expands the policy set for everybody. So let me stop for now.
Thank you, Bejoy. And before Michaella, I invite you to respond to that. We have two questions from the audience, actually. Can you quickly, Bejoy, just talk about what sort of investment we're talking about for rolling out CBDC? You touched on it, that it's simply the instrument needs to be provided, but what kind of investment costs are we looking at?
It really depends on country to country, but it's a fraction. If central banks, I speak to about 30, 40 central banks around the world who are all actively looking to implement CBDCs, be they advanced economies, emerging markets, or low-income economies. And it partly depends on the size of the economy, the size of the population, but if you crunch the numbers, there's a lot of savings that they do from reduced cash usage, and only a little part of it they have to move over to a digital infrastructure where they actually create the digital instruments. Now, as I said earlier, the payments infrastructure is already there, right? Be it you're in Indonesia or Madagascar or in Jamaica, where we are working in designing the system in Jamaica. So you're piggybacking off that infrastructure, and over time, that improvement in that infrastructure is also driven by the private sector. So it's a public-private partnership. And by the way, the improvements in the infrastructure, which, because of the expanded opportunity set, is good for the economies as a whole, because it drives, efficiency gains and productivity enhancing investments.
Thank you, Bejoy. Michaella, would you like to come in?
So I think that argument for sort of the cost savings with CBDC is often a very common one. Particularly, I think also the argument that investment into a CBDC can often catalyze governments to make sure that the system is adequately supportive of a CBDC. But I think those sort of scenarios are actually quite rare in my experience. You're saying that if a country wants a CBDC, they will hustle and find the funds to direct it towards to structural infrastructure. But I don't really think that's true. And I'm sort of, to use an example of Nigeria, for example. So Nigeria has launched or pilot tested the e-Naira in the past few years. But at the same time, Nigeria, as of, I think, last year, has one of the largest energy deficits or electricity deficits in the world. So at least half of the population doesn't have access to grid electricity. Now, that's a fact, and it's an infrastructural deficit that Nigeria has. But if you look at the design paper for the e-Naira, there is not a single mention of how the e-Naira would manage that situation. So for individuals that live their lives in the dark, and they only have access to electricity for a small portion of the time, the e-Naira currently isn't designed to account for that. Whether it's offline or online payments, if an individual doesn't have access to a charger to charge their phone, for instance, how on earth are they going to access the wallet? And again, you can argue that, of course, while you can have sort of an offline wallet that allows for value to be circulated between institutions and doesn't need to be online. But at some point, in order to mitigate settlement risk, banks do need to have online payments at a certain point. Governments need to be able to access that bank account so that they can send money through that to the right beneficiary. And individuals don't have days often in times of disaster to wait for money to come into their wallet. They need the money now so that they can buy food for themselves and buy shelter for themselves now. And if a CBDC isn't able to handle a situation like that, what value is it adding? And I think what I've seen in the past is that often central banks, or rather governments and public-private partnerships, yes, they will spin the argument that CBDC will stimulate actors to come together and address that need. But actually what it results in is money being funneled into CBDC, which does require investment. It requires money that otherwise wouldn't be going towards something like a CBDC. It means that it's going towards the development of that rather than just fundamental infrastructure upgrades like road developments or electricity. So I still question whether a CBDC is actually the catalyst for hardcore infrastructure investment, or if it's just something new that a government can attribute itself as being modern and digitalizing the economy. I think, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, finish, yeah.
I just wanted to, if Antonio will allow me, to just touch on the aspect of identity, because you also mentioned that.
Can I just come back on this point before we move on to identity? So, central banks don't invest in roads. They don't invest in power and basic infrastructure. Governments do. So there's a bit of a misconception in what central banks do and what governments do. Governments don't invest in CBDCs. Central banks do. So let's have clarity on that. So the investment we're talking about in CBDCs is coming from the central bank's balance sheet, and these tend to be independent entities. They're not in government budgets. No, they're not. They're not in government budgets. They're not even in general government budgets. So it's not an either or. Both need to happen. Governments need to do their own thing. If they're not investing in roads and power, as they're not in Nigeria, that's a separate issue. But what the Nigerian Central Bank has to do, as it is doing, it is investing in CBDCs, using its own resources so that it gives the population at large that digital instrument which the population is demanding. By the way, one of the things that the central bank in Nigeria is very concerned about is that 80% of the Nigerians are using stable coins and cryptocurrencies. And that is a clear and present danger to the sovereignty of the Nigerian currency and to financial stability in Nigeria. So central banks have broader objectives rather than just financial inclusion, and they worry about financial stability. And if I was a central bank governor in Nigeria and I see, 80% of my population investing in stable coins and cryptos, I would be very worried. So to come back to you, central bank is doing what it needs to do. The government in Nigeria needs to wake up and do what it needs to do on roads and power. I'll rest my case.
Thanks, Bejoy. I think that's a fair point, although I will say that central banks do often need to get sign off from a Ministry of Finance. They can be independent, but that's not always a given in every
Not
in every
really. Central banks run their own budgets. Sure, they'll get the sign off from the Ministry of Finance. Absolutely, they need to work together. But the point is, it's not coming from the government budget. It's coming out of their own balance sheets.
Let's agree to disagree. That I don't think you can say that in all circumstances, but I want to come back to the issue of identity, because you're mentioning that central banks have an array of goals that they're after. But I think to keep it within the sort of question that we're debating today, we're thinking about very vulnerable populations. So it's not the populations that are going to be throwing money at Bitcoin, for example. These are the populations that are living in offline worlds. They're often sort of just surviving, and they're a farmer. Yes, they may dabble in Bitcoin, but that's not going to be sort of their primary use case. What they really need is when a disaster hits, like a drought, for instance, is the government going to be able to see them and transfer the money to them so that they can be helped in their time of need. And I think this conversation around infrastructure really dovetails quite nicely into that discussion around identity, because the fact of the matter is that these populations that often need help the most are often the populations that don't have a digital footprint and they don't have access to an identity. And that could be for a host of reasons. It could be because of cultural norms that women really aren't really encouraged to get form of identity. It could be because they've sort of been remotely located and it's really difficult, inconvenient for them to get a new form of identity for that given country. Or it could be because they've been displaced and a fire has potentially run through their settlement and they no longer have their physical form of identity. And in that scenario, you would hope that you could be able to go to your local government agency, provide your name, provide your thumbprint, and then that's going to identify who you are. But in these very low income countries, whether it's sort of, Nepal or Cote d'Ivoire, these systems do not exist. And if you don't have your physical card on you, or if you can't remember what your identity number is, you're as good as invisible. And that's a very big problem, I think, for CBDC, because I'm not at least familiar with any CBDC currently being designed or experimented that is designed to not rely on an existing identity system. Every CBDC that I know of needs to either rely on the ad hoc, or they need to rely on some sort of digital proxy that can allow CBDC to run off of that. I mean, CBDC needs to have a CBDC wallet needs to be identified, or rather linked to an identity from just a financial risk perspective. And I think in economies where that doesn't exist, sure, CBDC could potentially act as a proxy identity through collecting different forms of digital identity to create one robust form of digital proxy. But I think in many economies, the legal system isn't equipped to manage that. Financial regulation isn't equipped to accept a CBDC as your identifier. So I think for me, CBDC and the issue of identity isn't sufficiently discussed, I think, whether amongst central banks or even with CBDC providers. It's a bit of an issue that is difficult to broach. And I think how it's been discussed is around sort of, okay, we'll have simplified due diligence and you can provide your mobile number and you can get access to a smaller wallet. But that still doesn't really help individuals that don't have a mobile phone. And these are the populations that do need money because they are at the poverty line. So how does a CBDC sort of account for that situation where you don't have an identity and it's not really easy to target you? And I'm not sure that a CBDC could do that.
Oh,
yeah,
so
thanks. All good points, Michaella. So, again, in economics, we have we approach things. One policy instrument is really earmarked one policy problem. The instrument can't solve all problems. But just to come back to the identity issue, the way the CBDC design, central banks are thinking of is the central bank issues distribution is through bank and non-bank intermediaries for you and I to use. Now, the intermediaries, so to get a CBDC, you need to have an account, or let's not an account, but a digital wallet with an intermediary, be it a bank or a non-bank. And for that, yes, you do need certain identifications, and it depends from country to country what they are. But generally, over time, we've seen the program in India, the other program, the biometric program. My hope and expectation is as CBDCs come and they're using the intermediaries, both bank and non-bank intermediaries, it will in turn spur movements towards an improved identity system, which could be a national identity over time. But that's not a good reason for holding up CBDCs. It's actually a very good reason for doing CBDCs and driving the improved identification process in the country at large. So think of it as an enabling factor. What are we need the sort of small policy nudges and tweaks. How do we get, in 2022, we're in a digital economy. How do we get the whole population digitally enabled? And if there are specific problem areas and obstacles, let's try and tackle them.
Thank you, Bejoy. And unfortunately, as much as we would like to continue, because I think there are many arguments that could still be unpacked, we only have about 5 minutes left. Already the hour is running away with us. So I would actually like to provide you both with the opportunity to just bring further points across, also in combination with your closing statement before we wrap up, as we will be cut off on the hour. So Michaella, maybe I can invite you to start.
Thanks, Antonia. So I think the points that Bejoy has raised is really powerful, and it's points that needs to be discussed in any discussion around CBDC. As I mentioned earlier, it's not a silver bullet. It does need to take into account what's needed from a system, an ecosystem point of view to make CBDC work. And that's great, but in a context where again, people rely on cash, and these individuals are facing ongoing disasters. I struggle with the idea that CBDC is a viable tool in economies that aren't digital yet. Yes, I know that a large proportion of developing economies are on the pathway of digitalization. And I think in order to enable that, you do need digital tools that can help support that and bring people along the journey. But it doesn't need to be sort of at the expense of individuals who are stuck in the dark, and they choose to be stuck in the dark, and they choose to not be visible to the government. But these are also the individuals that need help the most. And I think the argument that CBDC is going to prompt spending in infrastructure and spending in identity systems, I think is a bit of a fallacy, because governments have had years to do this. They know that the digital economy is coming. They know that their populations are in dire need of assistance, but they're not doing it. Instead, they're facilitating or pushing money into CBDC, which I feel is a bit of a poor use of finances that could instead be used to make economies more resilient. So what I mean by that is to say, yes, sure, you could put money into CBDC, which I think does to a certain extent come from the fiscal resources that a country has. It should be invested into making sure that your roads and your dams and just the fundamentals of an economy are equipped so that when disasters strike, like a hurricane, for example, it doesn't leave vast portions of population in desperate need for financial assistance. Instead, it should enable economies and households to adapt to those circumstances, and they shouldn't have to rely on something like CBDC for a rapid injection of cash. So I think the argument that CBDC could do that, I think is a bit of a fallacy. But I do understand that CBDC could be a tool, but it really does depend on what are the actual realities of the country itself.
Thanks, Michaella. Well summarized. Bejoy, over to you, 2 minutes.
Thanks, Michaella. So, we need to lift countries and populations out of the darkness they're in. We are in a digital economy with climate change, disasters, COVID. We need to get financial resources to people quickly. And that's what, when I'm designing CBDCs across 30 central banks across the world, every central bank I talk to and government I talk to is acutely concerned and acutely aware of where they need to go. And they're also worried. They're also, they think about the infrastructure things. They think about the identity issues and all of those things to arrive at the right design. But at the end of the day, we live in a digital world. So we really need to get more people out of that darkness which you're referring to, and we need to get them into systems where they will be much better off. And that's really the role of what governments are thinking around the world, and that's where the role of central banks come in to operationalize using their money. It's not government money. It's the central bank in Jamaica is rolling out its CBDC. It's not funded by the Ministry of Finance in Jamaica. It's funded by the Bank of Jamaica. So there's a big distinction between central bank finances and general government finances. But the point is, we're in a digital economy. We need to give tools for people to use, for all the reasons of financial inclusion and also financial stability. And CBDC is one step. It needs to be accompanied by a host of supporting policies. I completely agree. But if we don't start, we won't get there.
Thank you both so much. We do have one question from the audience, which I'm hoping that perhaps, Bejoy, you could provide a very quick answer to, because Hillary is asking how would a CBDC be markedly better for the poor than UPI in India, the payment system. So please, or the payment interface.
The UPI system uses mobile money. All it is a switch which allows people to transact between different mobile systems. But remember, you're still dealing in private digital liabilities. We've seen, problems with mobile money systems around the world. We've seen problems with stable coins and cryptos over the world. So in a CBDC world, you shift away from transacting in private digital instruments to a public one, and all the attendant benefits that it brings.
Thank you, Bejoy. Thank you, Michaella. I think the cost-benefit analysis here that we need to do are clear, but I think let's continue watching this debate, and we really hope we can continue the debate beyond today. But thank you all. Thank you to all attendants today, and all have a lovely day further. Hope to speak to you all soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.